My name is Tim, strength coach at Allegiate. Today we're going to talk about all the exercises we're using within our team and our strength program as well as practice for. Specifically looking at our primary exercise because this is the one we're building the entire program around. So team practice one, B number one, back squat. We like to rotate back squat, front squat, split squat to try to really accommodate everyone's strengths and weaknesses, not overloading a movement so much. But the thing that you'll find about back squat, it's got the highest potential for external loading. And that's good, right? That can give us more potential tension. That can give us more mechanical loading. That gets us more, right? Now, with that being said, though, is the technique that we're trying to utilize more in a front squat, this more upright position, loading hamstring down to the calves, is still the preferred method of squatting. And we're going to go through that a little bit and how we're going to leverage hands, eyes, and feet, your three weapons on attacking technique. And we're going to use that as kind of our basis to shift and adjust all technique for all of our primary exercises. But you're thinking, how can I leverage my hands, my elbows, and my feet to accommodate this more upright position with my torso? Before we get into that though, why? Why do we need to be more upright when we squat? Now, there's, in my opinion, a pretty big problem with mechanics and redundant loading, right? So we look at now, most of our clients are training 52 weeks a year, 3 to 4 times a week. We're going to get 52 exposures to squatting pretty much for everybody for multiple years. There could be some problems if we don't have really good mechanics or have a good description of what's good and bad, right? So the first and easiest thing to look at would be range of motion. Can we get this like hamstring down to calf position, right, with our feet flat in the ground? And that's why we utilize a lot of slant boards. That's why we use a little different loading position, because it accommodates that range of motion. And that's a good start point. Now there's a time and a place to do partial range. That's more for maybe this specific preparation for athletic performance. But for the majority of the time, we got to look at, can I get full range of motion? Yes or no? And that starts a conversation from why and what is limiting me from getting that, right? So why might be, hey, I have pain, or I might have some sort of restriction from a surgical intervention that might have happened a long time ago. Those are all legitimate reasons why we might not have range of motion. The other part would be, all right, well, if I don't have the motor pattern, right? So as I sequence down into a squat, and I start to get to this point where maybe this pelvis and the thorax have to adjust or shift, you might find a compensation by butt going back, right? So now that pelvis has to react to that torso. It's trying to stay upright, and I do one of these where my butt goes back as opposed to sitting straight down. And we're trying to accommodate that range of motion by how we can orient our pelvis and hips together, right? Which is why this front position is so nice. Because what it does is as I get to that sticking point, or that point where now I have to react to my thorax or my ribs, my sternum, and my thoracic spine, that this anterior load keeps me in this more neutral position and I sit down more comfortably. And what that does is creates a lot more tension here from this top of the knee to the top of the hip and this quadricep group. There's 4 muscles in a quadricep. And we're looking, how do we create adequate tension amongst all 4 muscle groups within this quadricep through the entire range of that muscle cell, right? So if I'm looking at a rec fem, which will attach in the knee and that pelvis, how do I create change in all the tissues going from that hip all the way down to the knee? And we see, this is where the real big premise for range of motion comes into play, is when I partially load, we strengthen the middle of that muscle belly, which is fine until it's not. And when I have such an overly developed muscle belly, we start to see length tension relationships start to alter and get off kilter. We also start to see some potential tendinopathies. And this is the issue that we have to address with our world, right? We work with clients working 52 weeks a year, 3 to 4 times a week for multiple years on end. Right, we can't hide behind, oh, they get to in-season, we can shift and adjust our training plan. Or, oh, we're going to have structural balance somewhere else. Or we're peaking for a specific quality, so I got to really overload that range of motion. We lose that luxury when we train as redundantly as long as we do. So that's why we accommodate range of motion and position at that range of motion to such a high degree. So when we're talking about back squat, and we're saying, hey, well, I want your elbows here, your hands here, I want your eyes here, your sternum here. It's to facilitate, how do I get as much range of motion as possible while keeping a more upright torso to load the muscle group effectively. And when there's a time and a place, we're going to try to do the same thing with a different point of emphasis and a different exercise and a different position with our hamstring. And what we'll do over time is start to stress the tissues over here adequately through a full range of motion, creating what we call hypertrophy or building up a muscle, not just in that one area, but the entirety of that cell by going through a full range of motion, having the right position in conjunction with the same thing what I would do in an RDL pattern or any kind of hinge pattern here, right? It's the same principles. How much range can I get and what position to that range do I have dictates the amount of stress in the area that I create. And I want to create an adequate amount of stress that creates this adaptation of increased muscle size, increased potential performance, but also too be able to effectively load this for a safer and longer trajectory by doing redundancy over a longer period of time. All right, so let's talk about back squat. So first step is the hands, right? So when we look at the hands, we're looking at a position where I can keep my elbow directly underneath my wrist and my knuckles. I like to say you're punching the ceiling, right? So now my knuckles are pointed straight up. So think about a punch here. If I was going to come at it like that, that elbow would adjust. So now I want to lock that wrist and I want to lock that elbow directly underneath it. Kind of similar principles to any kind of thing we're trying to generate force is how much can I leverage the position of my extremities, feet and hands. Same thing when I'm squatting. So when I look at this, thumb grip away for most people is probably pretty good. So I'm going to show from the back and then I'm going to try to get to the front position. So we set up here, thumb grip away. And then when I set up, I want that bar directly on top of my traps with my knuckles up, elbows down. I'm going to face you on this one. So when I load you up, we want to get to this position first, right? So now I'm in this position, knuckles pointed up, elbows pointed down, chin's tucked, sternum pointed straight ahead. And what this really sets up for is when I pull the bar out of the rack, that I'm not automatically in this elbow back, hunched over position and maybe creating an arch to get there. Because as soon as we arch, as soon as we go into that anterior tilt, and as soon as we want to push our butt back. And this gets into the first step what we're trying to address when we go into that squatting pattern, right? So when we get set up, we're thinking we want to be locked and loaded before I pull that bar out. So my knuckles are up, my elbows are down, and then I'm in a good position. Always like to address it. 1-2 step, just like shooting a free throw. If you ever played basketball, you know the guys who do the 1-2-3 set, shoot. Same concept we're squatting, right? We want to become mechanical with the setup because how we set up dictates a lot of the things afterwards. And if it's very improvised, if it's very in the moment, like happy feet because it's really heavy, the chances of you controlling yourself at a higher threshold weight or a longer duration is going to be lessened. So extremely robotic with the warm-up sets. Hands, eyes, step, step, then you have your feet. That's the next big step. Eyes are going to be straight ahead, feet are going to be straight ahead. So as I'm going down, you're thinking, I'm squatting down, I'm trying to keep my eyes directly in front of me. If you're struggling to keep your eyes directly in front of you, that means you're probably pushing your butt back and lifting your head up. Which goes into the first cue I'm going to give you, right? So we're just talking about hands, eyes, and feet. The first cue is going to initiate the movement with your actual pushing your knees forward. So one of the things that we see with the slant board or that foot elevated is this negative shin angle, right? So one of the problems we see when people can't get deep into a split squat is because they're starting off at a neutral shin angle and they have to go positive, right? So when we're looking at, it's not necessarily ankle range of motion, which is going to be a huge part of it. It's more along the lines going to be, well, how can I time that range as I go down, right? Because now that pelvis has to react to your thorax when we get to this more neutral position of the shin. And when I sit down, really dictates how much that pelvis has to dump forward and that thorax has to lift and blocks internal rotation of that femur or that upper leg. And we're not going to be able to sit down as comfortably. So when we're thinking about loading, we want to push our knees forward and sit our hips straight down. And this is something that's going to be foreign for a lot of people. You might have heard, hey, I was told to push my butt back when I squat. The reality is I don't think that cue is really well thought out. And I don't think that cue is really well designed looking at over a longer period of time. In fact, I would look at it and argue and saying that's a very poor mechanic, considering that it's artificially going to create this stability by creating an arch and an anterior tilt and putting a lot of stress in areas we don't want, i.e. away from our quadricep, right? The thought is We are training movements, not muscles, but the muscles are the things that we're trying to train, right, or adapt to. So if I'm looking at it from, I'm trying to squat, and I have this shin angle that doesn't facilitate me going down, or this shin angle that's back, I'm not going to adequately stress the tissues here. In fact, I'm probably going to get a lot of overlapping and loading of tissues that are not necessarily related to this. So when I go to a deadlift or an RDL, you see this compensation. If they bend their knees and pull, they're trying to find a center of mass and mechanical advantage to be able to overcome these ranges or these positions where they're just not functionally strong. And that really is a product. Do I have enough sarcomeres or tissues that contract? Do I have enough muscle tissue? Do I have enough postural control and range of motion to get there safely? Really is the bottom line. So as we're coming out and we're thinking, I'm facing towards the rack, my hands, my eyes, and then when I'm loading up, that movement initiates pushing your knees forward and then sitting down into the bottom of the squat. So eyes straight ahead, sitting straight down, trying to essentially get down to this hamstring to calf position with that foot flat. So as I'm loading you down, you're thinking, can I come out of this bottom position from here with my chest up, knuckles pointed up, driving straight up out of the bottom? So practice number 1, team, back squat. Can we replicate the same upright posture, the same loading of the quad when I'm doing a front squat, same loading of the quad when I'm doing a split squat with a heavy external load? Then we have a really powerful tool to change and drive adaptation. If we have to compensate by getting into this like traditional like butt back, nipples below your knees type of technique, we're not going to get the adaptation that we want. And we might actually get some sort of compensation and compromise to where we don't want that stress. The goal is not to lift more weight. So your goal is to leverage more weight towards some sort of outcome. The means does not always justify the end. It's the means that dictates the end. So if we look at it from that exercise is a good tool for more external loading, if I have a foundation of good versus bad technique, torso upright, top of the thigh parallel or below parallel to the ground, loading the tissues of my quad. If I don't feel my quad, if I don't have muscle soreness in my quad, if I feel a lot of low back, SI pain, chances are we're doing it wrong. We're doing it wrong. And if we can't get there, here's some modifications. Slant board. We're just going to prop you up on a slant board so when we sit down, we can get our butt straight down. So for instance, let's say that I have bad mechanics when I'm squatting. Okay, I'm going to put you here, and then we get into this good shin angle, right? So if I squat you down, and then we get down here, and we're still pushing our butt back, it's going to be hard to do that because my body is at this angle that is already forward. I'm here, so I have to adjust my pelvis, and I sit better straight down. So the game plan is, hey, we want a back squat to leverage some more external loading, but we don't want to do that for the sake of that. And then we get into this other idea of front squatting, relatively speaking to it. So if you're on a modification, meaning that you're front squatting and not back squatting, what it's doing is fighting that natural compensatory action of a anterior tilt, SI, maybe compression, or maybe L5S1 compression. And then we start to look at that as, hey, that is problematic because your only strategy from there is to load, push your butt back and further compromise that. We want to think about loading the tissues of the quad, and it's not really exclusive to heavy weight or an exercise. It's exclusive to appropriate aligning the tissues of that muscle group around that knee joint to get as much knee flexion as possible with a more vertical torso to line all the way from that mid to the distal and proximal ends of that joint. All right, guys, let's go on to practice number 2. Practice number 2. We're going to be doing pull-ups. Pull-ups is a pronated position, so palms facing away. There is a difference in grips. Anyone who tells you otherwise, just going to say it's flat out wrong. They're showing their lack of formal training in the industry. And I think this is a good kind of time to just go on a quick rant. There is nomenclature. There is names of things that we have utilized for decades in this industry. And just because someone without formal training comes in and says that's not the exercise name, doesn't mean that they're right. So when we're going through the right names of things, it is important that when we say pull up or chin up or neutral grip, that we know the right names of something. And I think as we start to break down why would we do a pull-up versus a neutral grip pull-up or a chin-up, just simply having a common nomenclature or terminology gets us a better foundation to go through what that exercise is supposed to do, right? And we know that there's a mechanical advantage and disadvantage of each. right? So when I look at a pull-up, this would be mechanically the weakest. When I look at neutral grip, in theory, that's going to be the strongest. Chin-up's hard. In theory, we should say that chin-up should be actually the strongest versus this neutral grip actually is the strongest, because that supinated position and flexion, so I'm externally rotating my upper arm, is a really hard range of motion for people. So if I was going to ask you to get all the way down in the supinated position, that's going to externally rotate that upper arm, supinate that forearm. That's a lot of range of motion and that much flexion of the shoulder. And that's hard on people. So when we look at maybe because it's mechanically challenging, not because it's mechanically advantaged, chin-up's not as strong as neutral grip. Neutral grip being here. Because we have a better position in that shoulder, we can recruit more bicep. Chances are it's more comfortable to get full flexion in that neutral grip, hence why that's probably going to be the strongest. But a pronated would be taking it away. So now we're more internally rotated, we're more of a pronated position of my forearm. So now when I'm hanging, I'm going to be comfortable from a flexion standpoint, but I'm not as mechanically strong because the muscles associated between my bicep and my lat aren't on as much tension. And that's okay. And what we want to think about from this double overhand grip is we're potentially making you weaker to get you stronger. And I know that probably feels counterintuitive. But if I'm going to use strategically a grip that's double overhand, knowing that it's going to be harder, that's going to bring us benefit over a long period of time. It's like the opposite of what we talked about with back squat versus front squat. Back squat's going to be able to use more external load. Front squat's going to be able to use less. Front squat might actually put us in a better position. Back squat has a higher probability of putting us in a worse position. Doesn't necessarily mean one's better than the other or one's worse than the other. It just means that was a bigger point of emphasis. And when we're pulling, we want to still make sure that we understand that we're training a pattern to target certain muscle groups. In this case, it would be lat. So, double overhand grip, thinking about a shoulder width apart distance. When we pull, we want to think pulling our elbows straight down to the ground. Now, a lot of times when we do pull-ups, we see what we call a lifting of the pump handle or that sternum. And what this does is create an arch, and then you're pulling that torso as a pulling your elbows down. Strength, grip, torso control, all make a big difference here. So if we're thinking about if I want to create as much recruitment in my lats, and one of the other things to think about is we're always going to be stronger eccentrically, and we have a 6-second eccentric here, that if I'm going to get that lifted pump handle or thorax or sternum, that I want to adjust by bringing my sternum down and lowering myself down. My cue for you, just keep it really simple, wrap your thumbs and elbow that ground. So as I'm pulling and thinking, how am I going to set up here? Elbow that ground, you have a better chance to basically get that lat really activated. So the thing now I want you to think about with pull-ups, it's mechanically weaker. Focus on the right technique. Grip really hard. Elbow that ground. Really try to pull with that rib cage pull down. And then if you can't do it on the way up, fight like hell to do it on the way down, and you're going to get that much more of the intended benefit. All right, that is practice 2. Let's get on to RDL next. So we're going to be on practice number 3. This month we're doing RDL. So when we're thinking RDL, it's top down, hinge. We talked about in practice 1 our back squat. So we wanted to load the interior portion of our leg, our quadricep. With the hinge, we're trying to load the posterior aspect of our leg. Glute, hamstring, right? Hamstring's got 3 muscles. We want to load them all up effectively. And a large part of that's coming into a range of motion and position, right? So we talked about with our squat, having as much knee flexion as possible. With our hinge or RDL, we're having as much hip flexion as possible with a fixed actual shin angle, right? So one of the things that we leverage with our squat positioning would be our upright torso. One of the things that we want to leverage with a hinge position would be more of an upright shin, right? So now we have a different fulcrum we're working off of. We're going from the top down, looking at that hip hinge and trying to pull the tissues from that shin to the back part of that hip to load up that hamstring and glute as much as possible. So when we're setting up off of that, you want to think, what is this exercise targeting? Hamstrings, glutes. If I feel it somewhere else, chances are you're doing it wrong. Remember, movement's not muscles, but muscles are the things we're trying to train. right? We are governing our structural balance or equal distribution of pushing and pulling to have equal stress on all the tissues associated with that exercise. And if we have haphazard, inconsistent technique, we can't directly line those tissues the way we want, and we're not going to get the results that we want over time. Not trying to get overly technical here, but I think it's important to look at the foundation of this. That if I have a push-pull oriented program, that whatever I'm pushing, I'm going to end up pulling, and I have very inconsistent and very, very poorly constructed technique behind that pushing and pulling, that whole framework is obsolete. Right, so when we're talking about tucking your chin, flatten your back, push your butt back, keep your shins vertical, that is intentional. That is intentional because we want to load from here to here with as much tensile strength as possible, or force as possible. And if I look at that from the concept of, oh man, I get to this end range and I start to squat down into it, or I start to lose my back position, I am losing the actual stress into that area, into other areas, and I'm compromising the result. And that, in a sense, is something that I think is, as we go through any of these videos, if we can understand, hey, I want to have a game plan of what joint I'm trying to target with any movement, as well as what tissues I'm trying to stress within that movement, and I can do that and I load that appropriately based off of that, man, we are going to be golden in terms of training safely and getting great results. The game is how long can I do this with great technique? It's quality input, get quality output. Very simple. So an RDL. Top down, shoulder width apart. Setup wise, you probably set up in the rack. So if we want to go off the rack, I think that's a great idea. Pull the bar out, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to be facing you, and I'm going to set up in that kind of like video type description. Thumb grip away from the smooth, wrap your thumbs. We like a double overhand grip. Why? CNS is auto-regulated. If you didn't notice, we test grip on this day. If you didn't notice, you should be testing this more often. But one of the big things we find with grip, above everything else, is one, a great indication of total body strength. So the more your grip gets better, the more your total body will get better, right? We usually see grip before we see anything else. The other part, it's a great kind of diagnostic of your readiness to handle external load. If grip is down, maybe you had a crappy night's sleep. If grip is down, maybe you're not ready to hold on to a load that's progressed from the week before. And if we look at anything, I'd much rather your grip give out than your lumbar or your low back. If I'm trying to evaluate what the biggest constraint is to overall getting great results, it's consistency and compliance. And if we're hurt, we can't stay consistent. And if we're hurt, we probably can't lift with great compliance. So if I'm trying to say anything with why we want a double overhand grip, it's let that be what you can do on that given day. That's it. If you can, great. If you can't, get to bed earlier, drink more water, have better pre-workout nutrition, whether it's supplementation, eating food before, eating food during. Like, you can't get mad at the constraint that we're putting on this for your safety. But what we can do is look at it from, you can change your habits and lifestyle. You can't outwork a bad diet and lifestyle. So grip is a great proxy for that. If you do know how to hook grip, that's fine. I'm not going to argue on that. This means, obviously, that you've gone through some amount of training and you've loaded your system to effectively enough where you can do this. If you've never hook grip it before, it's probably like learning how to do this in terms of front squat. Not that fun, so maybe it's not that worth it. But if you do know how to hook grip, completely fine. All right, so thumb grip away from the smooth, wrap your thumbs, maybe hook if you can. From here, bar sets up into that hip position. Remember, we have three things we can control. Hands, so hands are set. Feet are going to be hip width apart, toes pointed straight ahead. From here, we have eyes. So now as I'm going down, I'm changing the orientation of my torso. Different than what I did in squat. Remember, we're fixing the torso in squat, and we're fixing the shin in our RDL. So in this position, instead of thinking about eyes are going to be pointed straight ahead, looking at the wall in front of me, now I'm going to change the position of my torso, which will in effect change the position of my eye line. So as I'm going down, that position is going to change. So what I would say here, instead of eyes, so to speak, is try to control where your back is in space, right? So if I look at this, what is going to be more controllable? Your spine under load or your neck? And this is a concept called irradiation or packing. So one of the key concepts behind loading up the right tissues is locking in certain joints. So if I know how to pack a joint, meaning that I squeeze my shoulder blades in, I rotate my elbows, I pull my chin back, and then get this almost double chin-like look, the chances are when I get to the end range capacity, whether it's external load or range of motion, it's gonna be really challenging to hold if I don't have control of things I have control over. Meaning that I'm rotating my thumbs into the bar, I'm pulling my elbows back, I'm pulling my chin back and trying to set up for a packed neck position. So when I get to whatever end range capacity of that spine or of that position, essentially, I have a better fighting chance to hold. And that's the big key behind packing the neck. Tucking that chin, rotating your elbows is packing the neck, packing the shoulder in order to create more stability from the top down of things that we have control over, right? Because it's going to get heavy. You're going to get fatigued. You're not going to have a perfect setup for every single day. And that's the key behind what we can control. Hey, I'm packing my neck, I'm rotating my thumbs forward, I'm squeezing my elbows back, I'm setting up for a great hinge to load that posterior aspect of my leg, my hamstrings, and my glutes. And one of the things that we find is I start to lose head and neck position. I don't really start to create as much tension in my hands as possible. The chances are that that back is going to be the next thing to give. The final aspect I want to go through with hinging or RDLs is that shin position. So we talked about with squat that I want to bend that knee as much as humanly possible. Well, now I want to bend the hip, right? So now I want to posterior translate my hip backwards so I can get as much of a stretch here, right? It's the opposite effect we're talking about with the quad, right? The quad is knee flexion and then loading that whole entire muscle belly. Same thing here. So the only difference though, instead of the torso being fixed, now I'm looking at the shin because the torso is going to translate down. So as I look at that shin, that movement is pushing from the hip down backwards. That's it. Before, it was pushing the knee forward and the shin forward. Now, it's pushing from the hip down. And what that's going to do is start to stretch. So now I'm into those more proximal fibers. Then I get all the way down, keeping my back flat. Notice when I get here, that I'm not trying to get a little bit lower by bending, because all that's going to do is take the stress off the distal portions or the part away from where that joint orients. So if I look at it from that range of motion, keeping that shin vertical, that's going to stress the tissues through the entirety of that muscle fiber. So I have great adaptations in that muscle belly spread out all the way through to that end range of that distal fiber. And what we get from that is a really, really robust amount of stress in that area. And what you'll feel is when you wake up tomorrow doing a 6-second eccentric with a RDL, you'll feel a lot of stress in that given area. And that's what we want. That's what we're looking for. Is, hey, I work this muscle by doing this movement pattern with this technique, and I feel this outcome. It's when we feel outcomes of, I don't know where that came from, or I don't know why this hurts, is what we don't want. When we're thinking about playing the long game, it's leveraging these really robust, powerful movement patterns that have a high propensity external load in a way that we can do safely over a long period of time so I can get to the outcome of more muscle, less body fat, performing at a higher level. All right, let's go on to strength. So we're talking about practice number 1 in strength. Our primary movement in this workout is going to be a contralateral reverse lunge. So if my left leg is staying, my right arm is holding. And what that's going to do, and I'll show you what this actually looks like, would be getting some different things trained, right? So we're working a knee dominant squatting like pattern. We're working the quadricep muscle here, but this offset load is doing something else. Meaning that when I'm loading, this hip is going to want to react to how I orient the load, right? So if I have both arms loaded, that hip is going to be more balanced and centered. Where if I have the opposite arm loaded, now this hip has to react by potentially abducting and then sitting into the bottom of that lunge. And what you'll find is you might feel a little different balance and you might feel a little different recruitment going up through your core, right? So there's these lines, these can be called fascial lines, that cross over a midline, go straight down, go behind the front, go to the side. And all they're doing is reacting to this interplay of tension and compression, right? So we lengthen, we compress. Imagine like this the Golden Gate Bridge is probably the best example. That it's moving and it's still strong, and that's what we're looking for when we're trying to train movement patterns like a lunge or a squat, and trying to orient a different loading position, relatively speaking. And one of the beautiful parts about some of the fascial lines is they create more compression in the right areas and more tension in the right areas, right? So if one thing compresses, the other thing should tension. So we look at this interplay all the way up, and we start to say, all right, if I was going to do an ipsilateral, I would take away that abduction, which might decrease the stability. So when we think I'm loading up, and I'll do the opposite arm here, I'm loading up my left arm with my right leg. Now I abduct. This gives me stability. That tension that I create in the abduction allows for more stability at the knee. And when I sit, I should have a better pretense to get to that end range, which we talk about in our split squat mechanics, of hamstring down to the calf. So if I was holding a dumbbell in my left hand, you shouldn't be able to tell in that bottom position if I'm doing a split squat or a squat. And that's key. Range of motion still has a huge precedent when we're doing something that's going to be a little bit more complicated, I should say, or complex, because we're interacting more with the world around us, right? And there's variables like wind or external people around me that's going to influence my motor mechanics. So if I'm stepping back and I have a little bit more stability by creating more tension on that contralateral opposite hip of the arm that's loading, and I'm trying to get to that deep end range of that knee flexion to stress the quad effectively, I'm going to have a better chance to load it. And that is why we're thinking about this in terms of trying to change the loading, trying to still maintain a great pattern. One of the best lines I probably could tell you is the best way to train a non-recruiting or non-innervating or non-utilized muscle is to lengthen it. So if I'm trying to get more quad, okay, get it through a full range of motion and load it through that full range of motion. If I'm trying to train that hip, load that hip. And what you'll find is, okay, now that glute med is stretched, that glute min is stretched, that knee frontal plane traction is now in a better position. I can sit down more comfortably. That reverse lunge that normally used to hurt doesn't hurt as much, or doesn't hurt at all. And that's key. It's all about radiating and creating tension. Radiating is a big fancy word for creating stability. Stability in your joints, while the other joints are allowed to move freely. So we're thinking right now, A1, practice 1, we're going to go into a contralateral reverse lunge, grab as heavy of a dumbbell as you can sustainably hold with one hand, and try to keep 10 really good lunges on each side. And then as we start to build off of that, when we get back to more traditional movements like a split squat or potentially a hack squat or goblet squat, that we know how to leverage stability in our hip, our knee, our torso, so we can move through that full range of motion without any compensation. So practice number 2. Our first exercise we see here is a split stance. So 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, kettlebell rotational row. Why we like that rotation? It follows the natural corkscrew or this rotational aspect of a muscle and a joint, right? We see that when we start to rotate certain joints, it follows through with a little bit more force, follows through with a little bit more stability. And we put in there a little split stand position, just like we talked about with our reverse lunge. It's going to load that front hip. It's going to allow us to be able to get more stability. And as we start to pull, we should be able to get more force in that kettlebell, and we should be able to grab a heavier kettlebell. And that's the key. It's, can we effectively use positions, loading, to stress the tissues associated with that? And if you have a goal potentially of doing more inverted rows or even doing a pull-up one day, that the best chance of doing that is to close that gap of what you can control with what you can control. So if I can get you stronger with rows, if I can get you stronger with potentially grip, if I can get you stronger with core, and you have a goal of doing a pull-up, you're going to be net closer. But it's about looking at these things as all this chipping away at an iceberg. That if I can grab a heavier kettlebell because I'm in a better position, I'm stronger in my upper back, I'm stronger with my grip, I'm stronger in my core, then I should be able to be maybe net closer to being able to do a pull-up. And that's an amazing thing. We got KPIs coming up here in a couple months that if we start to look at that of like, okay, well, set a big audacious goal of being able to do a pull-up for the first time in my lifting career, well, it's going to start with doing the work and getting in here 3-4 times a week, improving your grip, improving your upper back strength, improving your core strength, decreasing body fat, increasing overall strength. that a pull-up is not impossible if you just really focus on what's going to make the things happen that makes pull-ups actually occur or not. It's not innate, it's not God-given, it's something that you can actually work on. And it just takes consistency and compliance over a period of time. All right, so let's go over this movement. So hopefully you can see my feet here. So we're going to go right foot forward, left foot back, toes pointed straight ahead. This is key. So if I get you in this position and this back toe is pointed out, all of a sudden, now I open up that hip and I open up this rib cage. Now I want you to imagine, so this is my torso. This is my back foot pointed straight ahead here, right? So now the end range, a lot of extension of that shoulder, meaning that elbow's coming back behind my rib cage. This knuckles pointed down versus, let's say that I'm in this position. This is my back toe pointed open. That if I was going to pull to that same degree, I'm not nearly the same extended position. Then I have to pull and rotate more to get the same level of range of motion. That you're artificially pulling that kettlebell up thinking you're at an end range, but you're not even coming close to where that's going to create most tension in a shortened position. So when I pull that kettlebell back, that now I'm going to be in this position creating tension in that lat, that rear delt, that upper back, rhomboid trap, and I get more bang for my buck. So a simple tweak of your feet of just getting both toes pointed straight ahead gets that rib cage and that pelvis pointing in the right direction. So when I get to here, that I have to finish and pull as opposed to getting to here and not recruiting the same way. It might feel like it's being overly detailed, but it's not. What it's doing is setting your foundation to get the most from the exercise. And simple organizing your feet, your hands, your eyes can make all the world of difference to getting the full benefit. So as we're starting to break this down and thinking about the big picture, get your feet set. Trap 3 raise. Anything we're doing a split stance, just have your feet in the right position. You automatically have an advantage in that exercise. All right, so back toe pointed straight ahead, front toe pointed straight ahead, slight knee bend on both sides, hinge down, one hand on the bench. From here, that thumb is going to be figuratively pointing in towards the midline, but we'll always wrap our thumbs. From here, we pull, we get to that rib cage, and we come on down. So that movement is there, right? So I'm rotating as I'm pulling. Think about a punch, right? So I punch and rotate, punch and rotate. We're just doing that in reverse. We're pulling it now. Instead of pronating into it, we're supinating into it. And what that's going to do is create more shortening, more tension, more bang for your buck, as well as there is a fascial line coming from this opposite shoulder to this opposite hip. So as I start to rotate, this spiral back line that comes from this hip down to this shoulder down will start to create tension. And it goes from this hip through this big fascial unit called your thoracolumbar fascia to your lat. And as I start to rotate and I abduct, now we have a lot more tension to begin with. And that's powerful because that lat it's a big muscle with a lot of muscle fibers distributed from that, I guess, the distal end coming from that thoracolumbar fascia to the proximal end going towards that shoulder. So as I look at the shoulder and you see maybe a really overdeveloped rear delt, maybe a upper trap dominant person, there's a lot of room for growth on that more distal fiber looking towards that thoracolumbar fascia, towards that mid-low back. And then all of a sudden I start to look at better recruitment along that muscle fiber. Just simple orientating of my hip and that thumb position to get into this rotational row mechanic. Just more bang for your buck. And you think about when is that really going to apply? Maybe it's applied to more stability when you get down to an RDL. Maybe it applies to more stability when you're trying to do a pull-up. If I have more machinery, I got a better chance of doing the things that I really want to do. And it just comes down to having more muscle in the right areas. So let's talk practice number 3. We got ourselves a split stance, contralateral, so opposite of the front leg or that leg that's more forward. And then we're going to go into this loading position on the opposite arm. Talked about this with our practice 1, that this different position in my hip, this different loading of my arms creates different stress up the kinetic chain and down the kinetic chain to load our fascia or the tissues that are supposed to not necessarily contract, but they do. but they're more of this passive energy transfer that creates compression or tension, and we can leverage that through our movement patterns, right? We talked about on our practice one that a lunge is supposed to stress that quad, but we're now going to be moving in this lunge-like mechanic, which can be challenging to do. So we do a contralateral load, we abduct that hip, we create more stability. Same thing now in a hinge. So we're looking now at a split stance, heel toe, not much more than that. Both toes pointed straight ahead. Every RDL mechanic, we want to control ourselves on the transverse plane. Think about this as much anti-rotation. So as I'm going down in this position, I want to open up towards that trail leg's hip. And what that's going to do is change the line of force on the tissues going into the back part of my hip, my glute, my hamstring. So we want to exaggerate that hip forward and load as I'm going down. And what that will do is create more abduction or pushing that hip out to get more of it that we want. So the movement, and I'll do a couple different directions, is just having this kettlebell mirror my front leg, pull, and then lowering it down. Dead, meaning from the ground up. So we're thinking we're loading that hip. You'll feel more of a stretch on this front side. You'll feel more tension on this back side. Pack that shoulder, pull, hinge down, so I place that kettlebell on the ground. If you're struggling to get that range, one, do stretch digitally with me every single week, maybe twice a week. If you're struggling to control it, keep coming, get stronger. We have a modification. We can go off of blocks. So we'll grab those blocks we did our movement prep with, the asymmetrical toe touch. We'll put that kettlebell on top of it, and now we have a lessened range of motion. And your still key is not relying on that and not becoming dependent on that. Your goal is to maintain tension all the way to whatever that end point is from the dead position, so you can leverage that by getting more range of motion and more strength at that range. The greater the range, the better the actual outcome. If we can load you over a longer range while maintaining your torso, maintaining your shin positions, the better the outcome, right? We're going to get more robust changes. And where we really see this, and to be honest, is why we push Nordic so much, is that Nord board assessment on practice too. That if we're doing our job of training to a full range of motion and stressing the tissues at the right time by having the right position, regardless if it's asymmetrical loaded, split stance, bilateral loading, the end result is I see stronger Nordics because we're training that muscle tissue in the back part of our leg through a full range of motion, which not only trains that muscle belly, but gets the distal and proximal, lift towards the hip and away from the hip, muscle fibers adequately. And then we'll see over time global increases in Nordic force bilaterally than we would otherwise. And that's the real test for us, is are we doing our job and testing the right things based off the program and the philosophy that we have? All of that aside, can you train safely 3 to 4 times a week over 52 weeks for multiple years? Then you know you have the right place. All right, let's talk about practice 4's primary exercise, low incline bench. Here's a quick tutorial on essentially why we like to rotate angles. So we are stronger in a flat position, weakest in a more vertical position. So bench should be stronger than overhead press. I think intuitively we probably really understand that. But what that really means is maybe we have more mechanical advantage when we're parallel to the ground versus vertical. Maybe we have more muscle groups that are going to be utilized. So the pec being primarily stressed in the flat, a little bit more tricep versus more vertical is going to be probably anterior delt, maybe a little tricep. So we're thinking about the muscle mass associated, the synergist or that tricep being able to be recruited, the angle which dictates your mechanical advantage or disadvantage, all going to have a big impact. Same thing we talked about with pull-ups. Same thing we talk about these like high governor exercises like front squat over back squat, or potentially an RDL with a double overhand grip. It's not shying away from angles or positions that are challenging because it might mean less external load. It just means a greater opportunity to focus in, lock in, and trying to get more bang from your buck from the exercise we choose. Which kind of leads into this, where does low incline bench fit in? 30 degrees, probably going to get different level of recruitment. Could be a little less than a flat bench, a little bit more than an incline bench, maybe a little bit more than a lot more than a vertical overhead press. And then you're thinking about, okay, well, if I'm in this slight inclined position and we think about loading the tissues that we're trying to stress when it's perpendicular to the ground, right? So if I'm thinking about loading my pecs here versus this more flat position, when does it actually start to stretch the tissues? And in theory, when I'm more inclined, that I start to stress the tissues of my pec a little bit earlier, and I start to get a little bit more recruitment of the muscle fibers in my pec. So if you look at low incline versus flat bench is probably going to get a little later stretch of the tissues of your pec because we're not getting into this abducted state as quickly, as well as it's probably going to recruit more tricep. When we're looking at low incline, it's going to get a lot more pec and a little bit less tricep. So that's going to be the key here is, hey, having variation with your angles, having variation with barbell versus dumbbells, having variation with fat grip versus normal grip versus sphere grip, having variation in general just keeps us honest on getting the right amount of stress in the right areas and loading up the tissues effectively over an extended period of time. Because at the end of the day, it gets into how am I going to load you up 3 to 4 times a week, 52 weeks a year for 10 years? What's it going to look like? And if I just constantly hammer flat bench with no variation or no angle or no grip difference, we're going to start to see the problems with overloading pattern redundancy, and it starts to lead into tendinopathies. We start to see strains and pulls. We start to see issues that we don't want. And that's why we have variation. That's why we use these governor-based exercises, because I'm all playing the long game. And if you're an athlete that had 8 weeks to prepare for a combine, it's a different story. But we're not doing that. We're trying to get maximal benefit while having the least possible risk. And that's why variations that lower the weight or potentially stress tissues in different areas might be the key to that. Variation's a really important thing. We got 6 with the 6-second eccentric. So you're thinking 8 to 10 RM load. So as we're going down and we're loading that barbell and we're coming down, we want to start that tempo early. And then where I really want you to think about with your head in 5 points of contact, head, shoulders, hips, and both feet, is what muscle group is being stressed. Do you feel your pecs being stretched as you're coming down towards the ground? Can we stretch from this sternum all the way as it fans up into that shoulder, that full pec? And if we can, chances are we're going to get much more benefit from that exercise. Where the beauty with 6-second eccentric or any eccentric in general is you start to stop and wonder what this is actually doing. That you actually have a time to feel that muscle moving from its origin into its insertion. And we start to think about this from a level of, okay, if I'm trying to load the tissues, can I pull that muscle away from its origin? Yes or no? Same construct, we're talking about range of motion with hip hinges and squatting. Same concept as when I'm going into the opposite direction of now I'm lengthened, do I have enough contractile ability to overcome and get into that finished lift, right? So now we're talking about different types of hypertrophy. So there's just general increase in the cross-sectional muscle area. And then there's now longitudinal, which range of motion allows us to put more sarcomeres or contractile tissue along the entire range. And that comes through range of motion and tempo at that range. And we're going to have a better chance of creating more sarcomeres longitudinally, eccentrically, than we would concentrically. And the concentric just means that we have the machinery to overcome that length. So that's your proxy of you developing sarcomeres and muscle tissue throughout the entirety of that movement. So low incline bench, different angle, different stress, mechanically stronger than overhead press, mechanically weaker than potentially flat bench. Going to recruit maybe a little bit more pec because we're more abducted early. We're going to get more tissue stretched, and then we can get a better opportunity to create more longitudinal hypertrophy, and you can get hopefully development through the full sarcomere. And quick discussion on muscle bellies and where things orient and insert. It's not going to move that insertion inward. What it's going to do is create more sarcomeres here and here through a full range of motion. Can't change the muscle belly. So if you ever think that the muscle belly in a bicep, that this is quote unquote flat, that if I ever wanted to have a higher peak, that essentially I need to increase this bicep tendons orient to there, so the muscle belly goes there. But if I was going to go through a full range of motion on a bicep curl, instead of actually moving that muscle belly inward, I'm now training the muscle fibers towards the more distal end. And if I got here and I figure out a way to create tension through like a cable or more horizontal position with a cable, I can get more muscle contractile tissue here, but I'm not going to change where that muscle belly inserts and originates from. That's fixed. But we can add more strength to a full range of motion by training the right angles to a full range of motion. All right, so that is practice 4. That is our breakdown. Hope you guys enjoyed. Yeah.